Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we analyze a stack of sources, research, field notes, and expert analysis to give you a high-resolution shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
Today, we're focusing on a really tiny piece of land in Denmark, Højbjerg Skoven, and it set off, well, massive alarm bells in the local village.
Right. This area is under immediate threat of housing development. And the whole conflict, it really hinges on one question that seems simple, but is actually incredibly complex.
It is. The question is this a protected forest, or is it just an overgrown, unused field?
And that classification, that simple label, determines its entire future.
Exactly. And the gap between the legal definition and the ecological reality is just huge. And the answer, as we found in our sources, it doesn't come from expensive satellite mapping.
No, it comes from the very sharp and precise observations of two high school students, Kesser and Steen.
From a nature and innovation class, of all things.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our source material today is basically the conversation and the analysis that came out of the students' project.
Yeah, their drone footage, their field notes, and really crucially, a detailed lunch meeting they had with a friendly expert.
And this expert provided professional guidance just before their final project was due.
And that guidance, it seems, fundamentally changed how they understood this piece of land. It revealed it to be far more complex and way more valuable than any simple classification would allow.
So Kesser and Steen, they walked into that meeting with a very specific goal, right?
A very specific mission. They were trying to prove the area met the minimum 10% canopy cover threshold. That's the legal requirement in Denmark to be classified as scoff or forest.
They were chasing a number.
They were. But what they found instead was that the entire area functions as this unified, irreplaceable archive, ecologically, geologically, and historically. And that finding, it basically screams, do not disturb.
So we are diving deep into those technical findings that came out of that expert guidance. Our mission for you, the listener, is to really extract the key arguments that prove Højbjerg Skoven's immense value and the serious implications for its future.
This is a story about how low-tech ecology, just good observation, can really triumph over high-level bureaucracy.
Indeed. And we'll start right where the students did, just trying to put a label on an unlabeled space.
Which is often the hardest part.
So Kesser and Steen, they show up with their first two drone photos.
Yeah.
They ask the expert for straight answer, give us the percentage, give us the classification.
Yep.
But the expert immediately puts the area in an ecological gray zone. Why couldn't they just, deliver a simple yes or no based on the rules?
Because simple metrics, especially in these high-energy transitional landscapes, they almost always fail. My best professional judgment, based purely on those first two drone shots, put Højbjerg Skoven squarely in the, and I'm quoting here, gray zone between forest and scrub overgrowth area.
Okay.
So under a really strict interpretation of standard Danish definitions, you just couldn't unequivocally classify it as a forest or skov.
So relying on that single number, that 10% canopy cover, is it's misleading.
It's inherently misleading. It completely ignores the internal structure of the system and, more importantly, its trajectory, where it's going.
Let's break down those first two images then, because they really set up the ambiguity that defines this whole place. What did the experts see that made them so hesitant to just slap a label on it?
Well, the first image was, it was the definition of ambiguity. You had these scattered clumps of trees, mostly young stuff like birch and pine. And in between, you had these clearings dominated by grass and lower scrub.
So very patchy.
Extremely patchy. If you were a lawyer trying to argue against forest protection, you could legitimately stand up and say the canopy cover was maybe only around 10%.
Right on the razor's edge of the legal line.
Exactly, which makes the whole system incredibly vulnerable to, interpretation and legal challenges.
And the second photo, it showed something different, but it still didn't solve that core problem of classification, did it?
No, not at all. The second picture, it showed denser patches. So in that one, you could visually tick out sections where the tree crowns were forming a nearly closed canopy.
So getting closer.
Yeah, locally, maybe hitting 15%, perhaps 20%. But, and this is the key, when you average that over the whole area, the overall pattern was still highly uneven, highly mosaic-like.
Okay, so it wasn't a uniform, continuous forest canopy.
Not at all. It was islands and channels, like a patchy archipelago of trees in a sea of grass and scrub.
So if that 10% rule is so borderline and can be argued away by planners, what criteria do ecologists actually use? What weighs heavier than just a simple percentage when you're defining a fractional forest?
That's the right question. We look at the quality of the system, not just the quantity of wood. We rely on three factors, and these are influenced by both international standards, like from the FAO, and domestic Danish practices.
And the first one is coherence.
Coherence.
And coherence means continuity, I'm guessing.
Yeah, precisely. A forest isn't just a collection of trees standing near each other. It requires a continuous canopy layer over a big enough area to establish what we call a forest climate.
A forest climate.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean on the ground?
It means the humidity inside the stand is consistently high. It means wind penetration is low. The ground is consistently shaded, which allows a deep layer of leaf litter to form.
I see.
And what the students' drone shots captured looked more like islands of trees in a sea of scrub and grass. You need that continuity to start and sustain that internal microclimate. Without it, you really just have a bunch of large shaded bushes.
And even if the coverage was high, if the trees themselves are the wrong kind, that also weighs against it being a mature forest. So what did the tree type tell the expert here?
That's the second factor, and it's a big one. You have to look at what's actually doing the growing.
Yeah.
And the species they saw, birch, willow, Scots pine, they are classic pioneer species.
Oh, wait.
The first wave, the first settlers. They grow fast, they love sun, and they're relatively short-lived. Their presence strongly suggests overgrowth or natural succession, not a stable, established forest.
Which would be dominated by, what, oak and beech?
Exactly. Mature, long-lived species like oak, beech, or ash, which, ironically, need deep shade for their own seedlings to survive. So the birches are doing the heavy lifting of colonizing the land, but they haven't yet created the stable, shady conditions for the next generation of bigger trees to come in underneath them.
So they're settling in, but they haven't created that full self-perpetuating system yet.
Not yet. And that brings us to the third factor, which is all about time, the successional direction. The area is, without a doubt, moving toward forest.
So the trajectory is clear.
The trajectory is clear. But right now, it exists in this classic intermediary stage. You could call it scrub or overgrown pasture, or, more generously, a young natural forest in formation. If you came back in 50 years, it would be a forest, no question.
But the question is, if it's not legally a forest today, is its current dynamic state valuable enough to protect on its own merits?
That's the critical nuance. And that dynamic state is what was confirmed by the context Steen provided during the meeting. That piece of information changed the entire reading of the landscape for the expert.
Right. What did he say?
Steen confirmed that farming, plowing, fertilizing, all that intensive use, it stopped in the area about 15 years ago.
15 years.
And when you add that 15-year context, the whole ecological picture just snaps into focus. This area becomes a textbook example of secondary succession. A young forest in formation.
So it's a recovery landscape.
It's a recovery landscape. It's working hard to become a forest. And the fact that it's been left alone for 15 years makes its current transitional state, where you still have open land right next to emerging forest, incredibly interesting and valuable.
It sounds like the legal argument then shifts from what is it called today to what valuable process is happening on this land, and should we protect that process?
Absolutely. And the expert's fundamental point was that this unstable living transition phase, which has both sun-drenched open land and shaded canopy, is often far more interesting and complex, ecologically, than a finished, stable, dark forest.
More biodiversity.
Way more. It's an area of high energy, high competition, and immense biodiversity right there at the edges. The key is to prove that value, not just get stuck debating the legal definition.
So if Kesser and Steen couldn't rely on expensive software or a clear legal label, the expert gave them some brilliant, low-tech, and incredibly robust methods to map the complexity of Højbjerg Skoven.
This is where the students, working with really simple tools, proved more than sophisticated models ever could have.
Let's start with this grid counting method. It sounds almost too simple.
It's designed to democratize data collection. It turns the debate from a subjective judgment, oh, it looks like a forest, into objective, quantifiable data.
35 out of 100 squares contain tree crowns.
Precisely. The expert suggested using a simple, transparent grid, like a 10 by 10 matrix, giving you 100 squares, laid directly over a high-resolution vertical drone photo. The students then just systematically count how many of those 100 squares are dominated by tree crowns.
It's elegantly simple.
Yeah.
But in such a complex, patchy area, how do you keep that counting method from becoming subjective itself? What makes that simple tool scientifically valuable?
Its value is in its reproducibility and its potential to create a time series.
A time series.
The grid is consistent. If Kesser and Steen repeat this exact method, using the same defined area, same photo angle in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, they create this non-manipulable documentation that actually tracks the movement of the forest boundary.
They're measuring the speed of succession.
They are measuring the rate of succession.
Right.
And that time series proves the area isn't static. It's a process that is advancing, and they can show how fast it's advancing. That, scientifically documented, is a very powerful argument.
That's fascinating. The data gets its power not from its precision today, but from its consistency tomorrow. I also saw there was a refinement suggested to deal with the fuzzy edges of the tree crowns.
Yes, because you want to avoid a misleadingly precise single number. Nature is fuzzy. So the suggestion was to do 2 separate counts.
Okay.
One count for only the completely closed, dense crowns, and then a second count that includes both the closed crowns and the near-closed crowns, where the edge of a crown is clearly dominating the square, but it might not be perfectly opaque.
So you get a range.
You get a realistic range or a span. In dynamic nature, that range is often much truer to the complexity of the system than any single exact percentage, and it shows transparency in their methods, which is key.
So once they quantified the canopy, the next step was to map the variation using a zoning model. I saw a reference permaculture layers, but applied from the air.
Yeah, this was about moving beyond just trees and not trees and starting to look for ecological identity. The area was divided into 4 interwoven zones that you could see from the drone photos.
And the first were the cores.
The cores. These are the densest, most sheltered spots. The crowns are tense, they're overlapping. This is where the true buffering forest, climate-high humidity, deep leaf litter, accumulating deadwood is actually starting to form. These are the engines of the future forest.
And then around those cores, you have the really competitive area.
That's the transition zone. The canopy is broken, and there's just fierce competition. Young trees, established herbs, opportunistic grasses, they're all fighting for light and resources.
It sounds chaotic.
Visually, it's very complex. From above, it can look like an open space, but it's actually where the highest ecological energy and the highest density of young life exists.
Next, you have the structural support layer.
The scrub.
The scrub or bush zone. This is often dominated by thorny species Cs, buckthorn, blackthorn, dense willow thickets. Ecologically, this zone is a vital motor for succession.
A motor? How so? It acts like a trap. It holds onto moisture, it shields the ground from wind erosion, and it provides safe perches for birds. And those birds then, distribute seeds into the cores. Without that scrub zone, the forest would develop much, much more slowly.
And finally, the essential open spaces. The memory of the past.
The open pockets. These are the critical areas of grass, bare earth, the traces of the old field. And these pockets are not failures of succession. They are necessary heat sinks and disturbance magnets that are essential for the system's overall biodiversity. They support species that just cannot tolerate shade.
This zoning is so robust.
Yeah.
But then Steen came up with an idea that takes this abstract mapping and makes it incredibly physical, visceral even, using a simple meat thermometer to measure soil temperature.
That's where I thought this project went from good to genuinely brilliant.
How did they even come up with that?
The insight came from recognizing the physical manifestation of a microclimate. If those 4 zones are real, then they have to create measurable differences in temperature and humidity. The meat thermometer is a beautiful, low-tech proxy for this. The important thing isn't buying a calibrated lab instrument, it's just consistent measurement.
So if they use this simple tool, how did they turn that into strong scientific data that they can use in an official report? What was the protocol?
The instruction was meticulous. They have to choose a warm, still summer day, preferably midday, when the sun's angle is highest and you get maximum ground heating.
Okay.
And they have to measure consistently at a specific shallow depth, 3 to 5 centimeters down into the soil.
Why that specific depth?
Because that's the thermal environment that matters most to the small life of the system. It's where reptile eggs incubate, it's where many insects overwinter, and it's where new root systems get their start.
And they needed to take those measurements along the edges, right? Specifically crossing the transitions between the zones.
Absolutely. The data is only meaningful when you measure it along that gradient. From the bare, unshaded sand pocket across the thorny scrub edge, and then finally into the shaded, leaf-littered young forest core.
And by doing that, they'll find, what, a few degrees of difference.
They will almost certainly find marked shocking temperature differences over very short distances. It's not uncommon to see a 10 to 20 degrees Celsius difference within a meter or two.
10 to 20 degrees, that's huge.
It's massive. Think about it. A patch of bare, dark sand in full sun exposed to wind might hit 45 degrees Celsius or even higher at that 3-centimeter depth.
Wow.
But the ground just a meter away under a closed canopy, insulated by leaf litter and shaded, might only be 20 or 25 degrees. That difference is the physical proof that this ecosystem is not uniform. It's a collection of specialized microclimates packed tightly together.
So the expert's so what argument here becomes undeniable. Development doesn't just clear the land, it destroys these physical realities.
Precisely. When you compare that temperature map to the zoning model, the conclusion is concrete. Building here doesn't just grade the land, it obliterates these temperature differences.
You standardize the environment.
You standardize the thermal environment. You add foundations, compacted gravel for roads, you take away the tree cover, you eliminate the 45-degree hotspots, and you eliminate the cool, humid havens. And by doing that, you destroy a huge part of the life the area supports, like the critically temperature-dependent incubation sites for lizards. It proves the entire area, however visually chaotic it looks, is functioning as a single, complex life support system.
And the functional importance of those hot sand pockets, it immediately leads us to the area's most important indicator species, the lizards.
Yeah.
The students had seen them thriving in these bare sand pockets, many of which I read were actually created by prior archaeological excavations.
That's right.
The expert called this combination of sand, scrub, and emerging forest the unpurchasable habitat. That's a really loaded phrase. Why is this mix impossible to buy or assemble?
Because nature rarely thrives when we try to manufacture it from a manual. We tend to create static, uniform environments. Højbjerg Skoven has such high biodiversity because it exists in the holes between the categories and what doesn't fit the manual.
The both-and environment.
The both-and environment. You have the sheer mineral heat of the sand pockets right next to the cool, humid shelter of the scrub and the forest edges.
And if you tried to build this mix from scratch, you'd probably just end up with a mess.
You would. A pure, dense forest would quickly suffocate the sand. The shade would kill off the heat-loving species that rely on solar energy hitting the mineral soil.
And a pure pasture.
A pure, manicured pasture would lack the crucial structure, the deadwood, the shelter, the varied humidity levels that the young forest needs to establish, and the scrub needs to act as that motor. This specific mix, it's almost impossible to create deliberately.
So it required disturbance, time, and restraint.
The perfect storm. The human disturbance from archaeology provided the raw material, the sand pockets. Then you had 15 years of uninterrupted natural recovery, and then, crucially, the human restraint to just let it happen. The lizards are the clearest signal you can get that this system is functioning optimally for biodiversity.
Speaking of structure, the students submitted a third drone photo. And that allowed the expert to move beyond that initial ambiguity and make a more confident assessment of the area as a whole. What did that image show about the canopy?
That third photo was the game changer. It showed the overall progression after that initial shock of succession had worn off. And using the grid counting methods we talked about, even with the variability, my professional estimate landed the total canopy cover at approximately 35 to 45%.
45%. That is a world away from the initial debate around the 10% legal line. That sounds like a clear functional forest structure to me.
Functionally speaking, it is. But again, the internal variation is what's so important. That 45% is an average. You had local areas, those cores, that were hitting 60 or even 70% cover.
But the open pockets were still there.
Yes, significant open pockets, especially along the western and northern edges, were still at 10 to 25%. And this leads to a crucial conclusion. The area is undeniably a functional forest, a young natural forest or a mosaic forest, but its structural variation, those high and low patches, is its single greatest asset. It's the simultaneous existence of those different structures that supports the biodiversity.
That makes perfect sense. So if the area is functionally a young forest, but its value relies on keeping those open pockets for things like lizards, how do you stop the forest from doing what a forest naturally does, which is close up, shade out the bare ground, and become uniform?
And that brings us to Steen's really sharp intuition about large grazers.
Right.
Steen's intuition here was just exemplary. Large grazers are the precise ecological mechanism you need to maintain this highly valuable transitional state. They are a natural disturbance pattern that can stop the area from closing into a dense forest, while also stopping it from becoming a uniform, manicured pasture.
They're the natural editor of the landscape.
That's a perfect way to put it.
We often think of grazers as a way to create nature. But here, the goal is to hold the existing nature in its valuable state of flux. How do they do that? How do they create that irregular disturbance that, machines and management plans just can't replicate?
It's all about irregular, non-systematic disturbance. When you put large animals, cows, sheep, horses into a big area, they don't act like a lawnmower.
No.
They scrape, they roll, they trample, they graze selectively based on their nutritional needs, the time of day, the weather. When it's hot, they go for shade, and they open up the soil where they rest. When they scratch and itch, they create these vital, irregular disturbances, bare patches, that become the heat islands for lizards and germination spots for pioneer plants.
So they hold the area open?
They hold it open, they preserve the sand pockets, and they keep the edges dynamically changing.
I can see how a machine would just flatten all that variation.
Yeah.
But I do worry about overgrazing. Isn't putting animals in there just another form of human intervention that could destroy the balance?
That is the essential planning challenge. The intervention has to be light, and it has to mimic natural processes. We're talking about low-intensity, seasonal grazing in large paddocks with long periods of rest.
So the goal isn't to get rid of the scrub.
Not at all. The animals shouldn't be trying to eliminate the scrub or the emerging trees. They should just be putting pressure on the system.
And different animals provide different kinds of pressure, right, which would enhance the overall variation of the mosaic.
Absolutely. Cows are heavy, they create intense, uneven pressure, they make wide, rough patches, they're good at opening up soil in damp lower areas. They also browse, so they keep young saplings in check without killing them all off.
And sheep?
Sheep are more selective. They maintain low herbs and keep the ground cover tight, but you have to be careful because they can make an area too uniform if you use them too intensively.
So what's the crucial piece for this specific habitat?
For this habitat, it's horses. Horses actively scrape the ground with their hooves, often to get minerals or to get rid of insects. And that action creates those specific bare, sandy spots that reptiles like the sand lizard absolutely need.
So the grazers would basically introduce a slow, natural rhythm that prevents that final closed chapter of succession from ever being written.
That's the goal. They are ensuring that the area never fully finishes. They are the natural gardeners of the mosaic, making sure the dynamic transitions, the microclimates, and those high-energy edges are maintained indefinitely. It just reinforces the core lesson here. The value of this land is in its current, active, and incomplete state.
This leads us to a fascinating paradox that Kesser brought up. If farming stopped 15 years ago and the area is clearly moving toward becoming a forest, why does the bare mineral soil, the fly sand, or flying sand, still persist on the hilltops?
Yes.
It seems to be actively resisting the march of vegetation. And this resistance, as it turns out, is the secret to the land's deepest value.
That's the moment the students went from mapping the present to understanding deep history. Because persistent bare mineral soil after 15 or 20 years, that's not a failure of succession. It's a function of an actively stabilized system.
So there are things working to keep it open.
There are 5 interlocking factors working together that keep these bald spots open, and they stretch back for millennia.
Okay, let's look at the physical forces first, the wind and the sand itself.
Factor 1, sand drift and wind exposure. The hilltops, the back top, they are highly exposed. The wind is constantly acting like an eraser, just resetting the surface. Even small gusts blow away lightweight seeds, fragile sprouts, and any accumulating humus before permanent vegetation can get a grip.
The soil is constantly being renewed to its raw mineral state.
Constantly. Then there's factor 2, which is the soil's chemical makeup.
It's just poor soil.
It's very low in organic content. Fly sand is essentially pure, fine mineral sand, often left over from glacial deposits. It just doesn't have the structure or the organic material needed to hold on to moisture and nutrients.
So plants can start, but they can't survive.
Exactly. They might germinate, but they die quickly in a dry spell because the soil can't buffer water retention. The repeated failure of establishment leaves the spots perpetually bare year after year.
And the third factor is the extremity of the climate right on those ridgetops.
The harsh microclimate is just brutal. These exposed hilltops suffer from intense heat and drought in the summer, which we talked about with the thermometer, but they also suffer from intense winter phenomena, specifically frost heave.
What exactly is frost heave, and how does it stop colonization?
Frost heave is a really destructive physical process. When water freezes just below the surface in fine-grained soil like sand, it expands and forms these large ice lenses. These lenses physically lift the entire surface layer of the soil,
Tearing the roots.
tearing the delicate new roots and ripping apart the fragile connection between the seedling and the ground. When the ice thaws, the seedling is just left lying on the surface, dead. This happens year after year, and it prevents any permanent establishment.
Factor 4 is the constant low-level interruption from animal life.
Biological disturbance, it's not just the wind. The small animals that thrive here, ants, ground beetles, and of course the lizards, they actively use and disturb the surface. They dig burrows, they bask in the sun, they scratch to lay their eggs. This constant low-level disturbance helps the wind and ensures that a thin, delicate organic layer can never fully form.
And the fifth reason, the final puzzle piece, was this idea of a fungal resistance to the forest.
This is the crucial finding, the anti-forest fungus. There is a specialized, unique group of sand and mineral soil microfungi that actively stabilize this early nutrient-poor stage without building up the humus layer that forest trees rely on.
So they're like a biological lacquer on the sand grains.
That's a great way to think of it. They bind the sand just enough so it doesn't all blow away, but not enough to allow thick, humus-feeding vegetation to take hold. This is clear evidence that the area is actively resisting closure through a specialized biological community.
And this leads us to the critical turning point of this whole deep dive. The identity of the rare fungus Kesser and Steen discovered. The Ned-sunken burstabezier, or the sunken bristlecup. Scientifically, Sepulteriella semi-immersa. Why does identifying this small, unassuming fungus just unlock the entire thousands of years long story of Højbjerg Skoven?
Because Sepulteriella semi-immersa is not just a rare fungus, it is a powerful indicator species.
Right.
And indicator species, they reveal highly precise, long-term, and uncompromising conditions about their environment. They're like scientists in a cup. They simply cannot thrive anywhere else. And its presence locks together the requirements for the Bronze Age settlement remains, where they found these amazingly well-preserved fish bones and fossilized oyster and mussel shells, and the current ecosystem.
We need to spend some time dissecting this link. How does a 3,000-year-old mussel shell affect a fungus that's alive today?
It's all about the chemistry. The sand, the fly sand, is inherently acidic, especially after centuries of Danish rain. But Sepulteriella semi-immersa needs an alkaline or calcified environment to live.
And the shells and bone fragments.
They're primarily composed of calcium carbonate. The waste pits and cooking fires of the Bronze Age settlers left behind all these fossilized shells.
So the shells are acting as a pH buffer.
Exactly. Think of them as tiny, time-release capsules of alkalinity. They've been slowly dissolving for 3,000 years, buffering the acidic rain that washes over these sands. They create these localized calcareous pockets of calcium that neutralize the rainwater, maintaining a pH level that this one specific fungus requires. Without that chemical niche, a direct marine and cultural fingerprint on the land, the fungus just cannot survive.
That is an incredible thought. The fungus is literally drawing the conditions for its existence from refuse that was left thousands of years ago. Let's break down the 5 immediate insights this one fungus provides about the site's ecological continuity.
Okay. First, long-term stability. This fungus is an uncompromising indicator. It cannot live in plowed soil, fertilized soil, or frequently disturbed soil. It needs sand that has been almost undisturbed for decades or centuries, with only surface movement from wind and small animals. Its existence is undeniable proof of ecological continuity.
Second, that chemical link to the shells.
As we discussed, the fungus thrives exactly where the fossil shells are present, which confirms this localized calcareous imprint. It proves that the very chemistry of the soil is dependent on that ancient human activity. The Bronze Age settlers unknowingly built the foundation for this rare biological system.
Third, it confirms the highly specialized nutrient level of the site.
Yes, extremely low nutrient level. This fungus is part of a system with an exceptionally slow energy turnover. It absolutely cannot coexist with rich, vigorous, high-nutrient vegetation or with a thriving humus-building mycorrhiza that would quickly lead to a closed forest. Its presence directly explains why vegetation is so slow to establish and why those sand patches persist after 15 years.
Fourth, the history isn't just about static artifacts. It's about active ecosystem maintenance.
Ecological continuity. The waste from the Bronze Age settlements, the shells, the fish bones, the localized alkaline contamination from their fire pits, actively helped create and maintain the open, calcified sand niche. This isn't just a place where history occurred. It's a living system that is actively utilizing that history. The fungus is using a habitat niche that has been continuously open, dry, and alkaline for millennia.
And finally, the ultimate conclusion. Sepulteriella semi-immersa is the missing link that explains the entire ecosystem's dynamic state.
It is the unifying theory. It connects all 5 of those resistance factors. The fungus locks the entire system into an actively maintained, specialized early successional stage. It's the reason the sand persists, it's the reason the vegetation is slowed, and crucially, it's why the lizards thrive in a stable, warm, dry microhabitat. The site isn't delayed in its succession, it's locked in a functional, specialized state that is scientifically incredibly rare.
What's so fascinating here is that the site isn't just a nature area with archaeology next to it. The two interests share the exact same thousands of years long soil history.
Absolutely. It is a unified archive. Geology, biology, and history have locked themselves into a very narrow, very rare ecological window. The expert's message to the students was crystal clear. You cannot plan yourself into creating Sepulteriella semi-immersa. It requires millennia of specific, undisturbed conditions. You can only choose not to destroy it once you understand what it's telling you.
So the single fungus just elevates the debate from a simple land classification issue, that 10% rule, to a matter of protecting irreplaceable deep history.
That's right.
We started this deep dive with 2 students trying to prove 10% canopy cover. We now have an undeniable finding of thousands of years of ecological continuity, all linked by a rare fungus and Bronze Age trash.
Yeah.
And this new knowledge, it translates directly into powerful, non-ideological arguments against the proposed residential construction. The alarm bells in the village, based on this analysis, are now deafening.
They are. The findings provide 6 robust reasons why residential construction is entirely inappropriate, environmentally destructive, and critically, very likely to face serious and successful legal challenges under both Danish and European planning law.
Let's start with the most critical one, linking right back to what we just discussed. The fate of that tiny, specialized fungus.
Irreversible loss of indicator species. The Sepulteriella semi-immersa is tied to unique, irreplaceable soil conditions, that calcified, mineral fly sand. Building involves foundations, roads, deep drainage, and, most importantly, adding foreign topsoil and then fertilizing it to create lawns.
All of which destroy the habitat.
All of those actions permanently change the hydrology and chemistry of the land, which guarantees the habitat's extinction. This is an act of irreversible loss because those millennia-old soil conditions cannot be recreated, ever.
And you mentioned that you can't just protect one little patch of land and then build all around it. The whole mosaic has to be functional.
That's the second point. Destruction of the mosaic via fragmentation. The entire ecological system relies on the interconnectedness and the free processes. The wind resetting the sand, the open space creating the heat differential, the grazers linking the areas.
Housing breaks all that up.
Housing causes severe fragmentation. Each house, each fence, each garden hedge, each road, they all act as barriers. They disrupt the flow of wind and the movement of species. This fragmentation destroys the function of the area by eliminating those necessary ecological exchanges and turning dynamic transition zones into static, unusable edges. You need the whole puzzle to work, not just a few isolated pieces.
And the most immediate legal hurdle involves the lizards, which the students saw using the bare sand for breeding.
That's the third, and it's a massive legal issue. Protected species, Annex 4. The documented presence of lizards, and these could potentially be species that are strictly protected under the EU Habitats Directive Annex for 4 in those bare sand pockets, which are their known breeding and resting habitats that triggers extremely complex requirements.
Could you just elaborate on what Annex 4 specifically means for a developer in the EU?
It means they are afforded strict protection. The developer and the municipality are legally obligated to ensure that the breeding and resting sites of those species are not destroyed or damaged.
Which seems impossible if you're building houses.
It immediately requires a thorough and expensive investigation to confirm the species and map their usage. And crucially, in a residential context, it is exceptionally difficult, if not impossible, to meet the requirements of non-destruction while you're simultaneously laying foundations and utilities. The legal risk for the municipality is enormous.
And the fact that the history and the biology share the same footprint, that strengthens the argument further in a planning court, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a judicial multiplier. It's the fourth point, a unified archaeological and biological narrative. As we discussed, the Bronze Age history and the rare present-day biology are not two competing planning interests. They are a single millennia-spanning story that is documented in the soil itself.
And planning law has to respect that.
Planning law obligates local authorities to take this single combined story seriously. If you destroy the specific soil chemistry needed for the fungus, you are, by definition, destroying the archaeological context of the shell deposits, and vice versa. It's one archive. It has to be respected holistically.
And even stepping away from the ecology and history for a moment, the ground itself is just technically unsuitable for this kind of construction.
That is point 5. Technical unsuitability. Building residential housing on flyvasand on an exposed hilltop presents severe technical challenges. It leads to poor foundation integrity, it requires extensive and costly engineering solutions, and it creates major long-term drainage problems.
So they'd have to bring in new soil.
Residential development here would require massive destructive soil exchange. They'd have to remove the original unique flyvasand and replace it with stable structural aggregates. And that action is precisely what guarantees the eradication of the natural and historical value, regardless of any future mitigation efforts they might promise.
So if the habitat is destroyed, which seems inevitable if they build, can the municipality just pay to recreate it or compensate for it somewhere else? That's what often happens in other development projects.
The answer here is a resounding no. And that's the final point. Uncompensatable value. This isn't like cutting down a stand of uniform commercial trees and then planting new ones somewhere else.
That's not a Lego set.
It's not. You cannot replace or compensate for a calcified flyvasand environment or for an indicator fungus with such a narrow specific ecology linked to Bronze Age history, or for a functioning dynamic transition zone between forest and open land. The ecological complexity is too specific, too dependent on millennia of historical input. There is no compensation that is technically or academically viable. The loss would be absolute and permanent.
So what this all means for Højbjerg Skoven is that Kesser and Steen's Simple School project has provided the local community with 6 undeniable, data-driven, legally robust reasons to stop this development.
That's the bottom line. Residential development here isn't just bad planning. It's scientifically illiterate and fraught with high legal risk. It guarantees an irreparable loss of irreplaceable nature. And the most powerful takeaway for me is that the students understood this deep complexity before the planners had even grasped the surface reality of the land. They showed that true environmental protection starts with rigorous, focused observation.
This has truly been a monumental deep dive. We started with 2 students agonizing over a debatable 10% canopy cover threshold, a simple number. We've concluded with a unified story that connects Bronze Age fish bones, the tenacity of windblown sand, the constant work of grazers, and a tiny buried fungus that acts as the guardian of millennia of ecological history.
The power of their work is entirely in the coherence of that narrative. Kesser and Steen's guidance through these low-tech methods showed how sharp observations from the air, from the ground, from history, and from the tiny biological level, they all connect into a single, cohesive argument.
They don't need to persuade with emotion.
They don't. They can simply show the evidence. The persistent bare sand, the lizard habitat, and the uncompromising requirements of the Sepulteriella semi-immersa. That is the hallmark of genuine discovery.
It's a profound reminder that we often overlook the value of things that are seemingly unfinished or scrubby, or that just fail to fit neatly into our bureaucratic categories.
If there is one core message that comes out of this entire deep dive, it's the one the expert wanted to convey to Kesser and Steen and to you, the listener. This place is not finished, and precisely because of that, it is valuable.
It's valuable because it's in process.
Its value lies not in becoming a static, mature forest, but in its current dynamic, active, and balanced process. It's valuable because it is constantly working, constantly resisting closure, and constantly providing specialized niches for life that simply cannot exist in a stable, finished environment. So taking this insight out into the world with us, we often hear the natural environment described so simply, maybe as a Lego set. Something you can take apart, move, compensate for, and put back together somewhere else. But Højbjerg Skoven teaches us a different, far more complex lesson.
So consider this. What other seemingly overgrown, scrubby, or transitional landscapes are there around you that are actually highly valuable unified archives? What places actively resist closure or completion? We risk clearing away these transitional spaces simply because they don't look like a finished product on a postcard.
And Højbjerg Skoven proves that the landscape that resists definition.
That landscape often holds the deepest, most irreplaceable history, waiting only for an astute pair of eyes, or maybe just a simple meat thermometer, to reveal its constraints. We have to look closely at the places that refuse to fit our simple categories. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we analyze a stack of sources, research, field notes, and expert analysis to give you a high-resolution shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.